President.
The senator from Minnesota.
Madam President, I first wanted to thank Senator Portman for his incredible work on Ukraine. He has given dozens and dozens of talks on this floor, but what's equally important is all the work he's done behind the scenes, working across the aisle, making sure the funding is there for the weapons, meeting directly with President Zelensky. And I just want to thank him for his incredible leadership. And we will continue his work. And I have a feeling he will be calling us from Ohio or wherever he is to make sure we're doing it right. So I thank you for that. We are here today to speak about democracy. And of course, that's on the line in Ukraine. President Zelensky reminds us about it every day when he says the simple words, "We are here." That's what he said the day of the Russian invasion. He went to the street corner and said, "We are here." Well, that's what we are here to say today, is that there are people that are carrying the torch for democracy in our own country. I am glad to be joined with my colleagues today, Senator Whitehouse, who has been such a leader when it comes to the Disclose Act and that part of our democracy, as well as voting to make sure our democracy and make the case our democracy does not work if we do not have campaign finance and things that are transparent and know where that money's coming from, because it drowns out the voices of everyday people. Senator King is with us today on the floor, who is a member of the Rules Committee, introduced with Senator Durbin and myself the original reform to the Electoral Count Act, and has been a true leader when it comes to voting reform. The presiding officer herself will be addressing this from the great state of New Hampshire, where they understand a little bit about a democracy in freedom and what that means. And then Senator Merkley, the original sponsor of the For the People Act, which really set the table for the discussions we've been having on voting rights and the close vote we had when it came to finally passing the Freedom to Vote Act, which was built on the work that Senator Merkley and many others did on the For the People bill. Madam President, nearly 2 years ago, a violent mob of insurrectionists stormed into this chamber right here. We're looking at the desks that they were opening up. We're looking at the presiding dais, which they invaded. They desecrated our Capitol. They interrupted the hallmark of our democracy, the peaceful transfer of power. Just this last week, we gave the Capitol Police, the D.C. Metro Police, the police that protected us Day, the Congressional Medal of Honor. So many brave officers were there for us, and democracy prevailed that day. But what we have learned is that what the insurrectionists didn't finish with bear spray and flagpoles in the United States Capitol, others have tried to do with voter suppression laws, nonsense lawsuits, threats of violence. They have literally attempted to shut down the rule of law, to shutter our voting laws, and they literally have mocked and made fun of political acts of violence. Simply put, we know that federal action was and is needed. That's why we introduced the Freedom to Vote Act to protect every American's right to vote in the way that works best for them. Through a summer of intense negotiations, we got all 50 Democratic senators on board. Sadly, our efforts were halted by the filibuster, but we did not give up. And we have not given up on that bill, as well as the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. Still, we are making progress in other places. A number of state laws voter suppression laws have been thrown out by courts, including by conservative judges. A number of state legislatures have taken action to protect the right to vote. And then finally, just this week, as part of this omnibus bill before us, we are on the verge of getting the bipartisan Electoral Count Reform Act signed into law. We thank Senator Manchin and Senator Collins for their leadership, as well as the so many other senators that were part of that effort. I thank the members of the Rules Committee. We were able to get the bill with some changes that Senator Blunt and I worked on together that were supported on a bipartisan basis through the Rules Committee on a 14-to-1 vote. This year, it became clear that our democracy itself is on the ballot. The American people could be moved to act, and opponents of democracy, as we know, tried to put election deniers on the ballot. But whether it was Democrats, moderate Republicans, independents, they rallied around people who would stand up for our democracy. In many states across the country, when it came to Election Day, the highest vote getters were not the most famous politicians. They were the Secretary of States who in many cases were not household names, but were running against people who were election deniers. And they ended up, including in my own state, having the highest vote percentages, highest vote totals of anyone in the state. So what about the Electoral Count Act? This is an antiquated law passed in the 1800s, which was never meant to be a trigger point for an insurrection. What we have done with this bill that I believe we will pass this week is we've made it absolutely clear that the Vice President does not have the power to reject electoral votes. We all remember the words, the horrific words, "hang Mike Pence," uttered just a few yards away from the Vice President in this very building. We need to also raise the threshold for objecting to electoral votes so that it takes more than 2 out of 535 elected members to gum up the counting. Even before the insurrection, when Senator Blunt and I looked at the objections that were going to be made, in many cases by 1, 2, 3 senators, we realized it would take at least 24 hours to get through them. In fact, there is nothing stopping under this antiquated law a single senator and a single House member from objecting to every single state, including the states that perhaps their candidate had won, just to gum up the works. That is why we have pushed for the Electoral Count Act. Moving forward, we must address the root causes, not only of these antiquated laws, not only of voter suppression, but also disinformation and misinformation that allows lies that undermine our elections to go viral and violent. On January 6th, we saw the cost of these lies up close. That is why we have to address the impact of disinformation online on our democracy. We can start by looking at the liability protections that we have put in place. Back when, yes, internet companies were starting in garages, back at the beginning, we have a legal provision, Section 230, that protects social media companies from liability for the posting and spreading of dangerous content on their platforms. We know people are going to post things that are hateful, that aren't true. But the question is, when companies' algorithms are designed, in fact, to make money off of repeating those lies and expanding them, and despite some efforts to reduce them, it keeps coming and coming and coming. I don't know why we would put in liability protections for that. If someone were to yell fire in a crowded theater, that person would be liable. That is not protected speech. But if the theater had in rules that protected its patrons, they wouldn't be held liable for that. But what if the theater was a multiplex and it decided that they would broadcast the words of the person yelling fire in all of its theaters? Would we think that was okay? Well, that is exactly what is going on with disinformation and hate speech on the internet right now. Companies are allowed to repeat hateful disinformation, and they actually can profit from it. And that's why many of us believe it is time to look at Section 230 and the immunity that this Congress has given them. In addition, Americans should know who is behind the political ads they see online. We need to put in place the same rules for social media platforms that currently apply to political ads sold on TV, radio, and in print. That is a bill that I had with Senator McCain and now with Senator Graham. It is time to bring that bill up for a vote. Even though the FEC has made some changes, they're not nearly what we need to have in place to allow Americans to have the information that they need. Finally, we have to talk about protecting people's right to vote. In the 2020 election, in the middle of a global pandemic, more than 160 million Americans voted, more than ever before in what the then Trump Department of Homeland Security called the most secure election in American history. A big reason turnout was so high in 2020 was that states went out of their way to make it easier for people to vote because of the pandemic. In the wake of that record voting, we saw a coordinated effort by state legislatures to make it harder to vote. In 2021, 18 states passed 34 restrictive voting laws, but the people of this country pushed back. Look at what happened in Georgia. There were concerted efforts to limit voting during the runoff and make voting by mail more confusing. Still, Georgians found a way to make their voices heard. Some observers will look at the result and decide that, oh, this was a threat, it was overplayed. But to paraphrase my friend Senator Warnock, this outcome doesn't mean that voter suppression does not exist. It simply means that the people have decided their votes will not be silenced. That is what we're dealing with right now, and we should be making an effort to make it easier for people to vote, and the best way to do that is to set some minimal federal standards for voting. Last thing I'd like to say is to thank Senator Blunt, who has been my co-chair of the Rules Committee. He's been ranking, I've been chair, he's been ranking. And we've worked together, especially on the issue of protecting election workers and making sure that federal funding was allowed to go for that purpose. It was Senator Blunt and I that were the last senators here at 4 in the morning on the night of January 6th. With Vice President Pence, we made that walk through the broken glass, by the spray-painted pillars, with the 3 pairs of pages, holding the mahogany boxes with the last of the ballots up through Wyoming. We got to the House chamber and democracy prevailed. And after that, Senator Blunt and I went downstairs, the sun was coming out, and visited the parliamentarian's office. As I look at our valiant staff right now sitting there, what I remember is the chaos and destruction in their own office, which had been targeted by the insurrectionists. I remember the broken picture on the floor. I remember all the papers all over the place. That's what we saw that day, and that was forever, ever marked in my memory of how close we were that this antiquated law was being used as a reason for these insurrectionists to come in to our very offices. Senator Blunt and I walked out of the parliamentarian's office that day, sun coming in, and I still remember he looked at me and he said, well, I'll see you tomorrow then. We've got a lot of work to do. I'm proud of the work we've done since then. And one of the most important things we've done is to reform this law. And I want to thank my colleagues that understand that that is just the beginning and not the end. And with that, I will turn it over to Senator Whitehouse. Thank you, Senator Whitehouse, for your incredible leadership on campaign finance.
Madam Chair, Madam President.